welcome everyone to this fourth event in our series of events on Insect Week. So thank you, Padma, for curating such an amazing collection of events for us all to listen into. And as Padma mentioned, I'm the CEO of the Linnean Society, and I've only been here for 2 months. And what I'm discovering about this organization is that it's just an incredible organization, as I'm sure many of you already know. You probably all know the organization better than I do. But this wonderful vision that we have of a world where nature is understood, valued, and protected. And it's just an incredible event that brings together an incredible organization that brings together these events, our wonderful education program, and our loyal and supportive fellows. And what I really love about the organization is that anyone can be a fellow. So you don't have to be an academic necessarily, you can just be interested in nature and just really enjoy meeting and interacting with like-minded individuals. So as I said, it's an incredible organization. This is going to be an amazing talk today. So I'd really like to welcome Joanne and just say thank you so much, Joanne, for being with us today and giving up your time to share with us your research. Joanne is a PhD student at the History and Philosophy of Science department at the Cambridge University. And I think I'm very intrigued by the title of your talk. It seems very different to the other talks that we have on this week. And without further ado, I would just like to invite you to tell us more about We the Tormentors. Over to you, Joanne.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for having me. Today, I'll be talking about insects and emotions. So, at the heart of the practice of collecting, there is a dilemma. Naturalists usually hold a deep-seated love for the natural world and for their objects of interest. However, in order to be a collector, one has to kill the things one loves. To explore this issue, I will focus on one woman, Margaret Fountaine, and her ambivalence towards collecting butterflies. To start, I will give you a bit of background about Fountaine and on women in the British entomological community around the turn of the 19th century. After that, I will analyze her emotions towards collecting as they appear in her private diaries. And following that, I will look at her scientific publications and how she constructed her scientific persona through them. I will show how, while Fountaine was ambivalent towards the practice of collecting, these were emotions she expressed only in the privacy of her diaries, while publicly she displayed a scientific persona crafted of two opposing narratives, the objective researcher and the white imperial huntress, in order to evade the label of female sentimentality. Fountaine was born in Norfolk to an upper-middle-class family and became financially independent at the age of 27, after receiving an inheritance bequeathed to her by an uncle. By 1895, entomology, and in particular butterflies, that is, lepidoptery, became her main occupation and her career. She was extremely widely traveled, as you can see from this map. She collected and studied butterflies in numerous countries all around and was widely known and liked in the European entomological community. She was considered an expert on Lepidoptera, and especially their breeding and life cycles. And in 1898 and 1907, respectively, she became a member of the Entomological Society of London and of the South London Entomological and Natural History Society. Between 1892 and 1940, Fountaine had created an impressive collection of more than 22,000 butterfly specimens and published 19 articles and notes in the entomological periodical press. Throughout the 19th century and well into the 20th, there were very few women who actively participated in the British entomological community. According to statistics I compiled using data gathered from the Entomological Society of London, in 1897, the year in which Fountaine joined the society, there were only 6 other women. Together they made up 1.62% of the society. But by 1921, women still formed only 2.2% of the membership. I mention this because attention to numbers is important when discussing women in science. The percentage of women in certain fields tells us how likely they were to have had predecessors who could serve as role models, whether they had clear routes to practice science as women, and so on. And in the case of entomology, at the turn of the 19th century, every woman had to make her own way. Collecting was one of the practices most accessible to women, and in my research I have found that, in particular, creating a collection of exotic specimens from outside of Britain, especially from around the empire, gave women some authority within the entomological community. That was due to the fact that most entomologists were unable to afford to travel around the world. Fountain's collection was very unique for two reasons. First, sheer breadth, containing specimens from every continent except for Antarctica. And second, she reared many of the specimens herself, from ova or larvae, which meant that many of her specimens were green, as they were killed straight out of the chrysalis. But also that she gathered of knowledge about the butterflies' life cycles, their behavior and food plants. So to some, the practice of collecting was central to her identity as an entomologist. However, she had an ambivalent attitude towards it, which I shall now analyze. On the one hand, she evidently derived a lot of pleasure from collecting. She started collecting in a methodological manner while touring Italy and Switzerland with her sisters, and her love of entomology grew as she accumulated more specimens. Her passion for butterflies, quote, increased daily as I added constantly new species to my collection. Her collection was both a source of aesthetic joy and a repository of memories and nostalgia, with each specimen evoking a different time and place, people she knew, and experiences she had. Every time she rearranged the drawers, she tapped into these memories. Here she is, describing a virtual voyage through her cabinet drawers. A few brilliant proponents gave me such a longing to be back in Brazil. The contents of the next drawer took me back to India and Java, for there were the calimas, so reminiscent of days long, long ago, such happy days spent with dear Charles. And then came the charaxes full of hot African sunshine. The butterflies, those, quote, dead relics of a bygone summer, embodied the foreign landscapes in which they had been collected. They were a form of embodied memories. She writes, something must always still be left of the sunny mountains and glowing valleys, as long as I can take out one of my cabinet drawers and feast my eyes on its contents. She also enjoyed the thrill of hunting butterflies. In her diary, she explains that the life of the entomologist was often made up of weary days of toilsome climbs under the blazing sun and long hours of thirst and fatigue, but that it was all worth it for the joys of the enthusiastic butterfly hunter. Treasure such as this, flying everywhere in wild, reckless profusion, alluring the excited biped to rush heedlessly over a ground of the roughest description, now jumping, now slipping, maybe sometimes even falling, but never pausing in the hard pursuit of the fascinating little insect that will make such a grand acquisition to the collection at home. However, at the same time, Fountaine also felt great sympathy towards the butterflies and guilt about killing them. She habitually anthropomorphized butterflies in her diary and articles. She always referred to them as he or she, and when seeing a species for the first time, described it as making their acquaintance. She attributed different traits and emotions to them. One species had a, quote, greedy love of the lantana flowers. Another flew everywhere in wild ecstasy, while tropical butterflies tend to, quote, wedge in as much joy and gladness as possible in the short span of their brief existence. Butterflies could be shy or else annoyed and disgusted. Sorry. Butterflies could be shy or else annoyed and disgusted. One species romped and gamboled with his fellows all through the summer, and when caught he was angry, not frightened. And the same applied to butterfly caterpillars. Those of one species were described as lying and quarrelsome with one another. They even had skirmishes in which one of them murdered another. Fountaine genuinely loved the butterflies she collected. She described herself and her partner as, quote, "the spoilers seeking for their prey, it is true that we were, but spoilers who loved the tiny lives they quenched into silence." Hence Fontaine's dilemma. In order to be an entomologist, she had to kill the things she loved, as her entire identity and authority as an entomologist rested in her collection. When collecting specimens of the species Papio napi, she wrote, "It seemed so brutal to rob them of all their little dusky wives, and the mothers of the next brood, but then there was no choice but to take a good thing when I saw it, or give up collecting altogether." While her love of entomology was usually strong enough to distract her, it wasn't always sufficient. After spending 3 days catching nearly all of the Colias in an Austrian forest, Fountaine was overwhelmed with guilt and wrote, quote, "I hated myself soundly for having been the cause of this cruel slaughter." Natural history had a brutal side, and Fountaine was fully aware of it. She confided in her diary that she often thought of the butterflies spending their days in their beloved glades, blissfully happy, till we come with our nets, we the tormentors, the destroyers, and we take their little lives from them and call it science, when hundreds of tiny existences are cut short. In another passage, she describes a new batch of salmon-colored butterflies that have just emerged in one of her breeding cages. Just come out into their new life, how they longed to spread their beautiful wings and fly away, instead of which they would be made to pass their short existence in the dark under a bed in my room, soon afterwards to have the little flutterings quickly, while a number of dead or dying butterflies will be lying at the bottom of the breeding cage. And now they will be perfect specimens in collections for years to come. Her feelings were further complicated when she started hand-rearing butterflies. The maternal act of daily care made her loath to kill them. She writes mournfully, quote, "I feel dreadfully sorry to have to kill them as soon as they emerge. They are so weak and helpless." One example from her diary is especially illustrative. One female Dardanus had developed from 3 ova Fountaine had bred. At first she was really excited, as she had been missing a female of that species for her collection. Now that it was as I had hoped, I never before felt more sorry for any butterfly I have ever bred. She stretched out her long proboscis and seemed to be feeling about for something to suck, and I gave her petrol till she died, and that was all. She was then reminded of an incident from her childhood. Her father and brother were killing sparrows as pests, and she was helping them. She retained a vivid memory of one female sparrow that she had released from the net, who looked at her with piteous eyes. She longed to release her, but afraid of angering her brother, she killed her. And still the look of that helpless little hen sparrow has come back to me through life from time to time, but never quite so vividly as on that day. And now that female Dardanus will always be there in my collection to remind me of the pangs of remorse I felt before I took her life. The little caterpillar I tended with such care. These quotes demonstrate not only Fontaine's feelings for butterflies, but also the wider paradox in the life sciences. Its practitioners were often fueled by a love of nature, but in order to practice natural history, they killed their subjects of love and fascination. What is further interesting is that Fountaine isn't describing just her emotions, but also the butterflies, whom she represents as feeling creatures that suffer. She was caught between her protective feelings for the butterflies and the reality that her chosen vocation necessitated their killing. She had hoped that one of the ova would produce a butterfly so that she would be able to add the species to her collection. But once the butterfly emerged, her feelings towards the little creature that she had nurtured caused her to feel like a murdering mother. In a conversation with a botanist acquaintance, she asked whether he had ever felt sorry to cut down trees. He replied that sometimes he felt, quote, some slight qualm of regret. To which Fountaine responded in her diary, writing, quote, but of course, I quite understand that it is his job, just as it is my job to catch a beautiful and rare specimen of a butterfly when I see it, however reluctant I may feel to do so. She was critical towards entomologists who killed more than they needed to. One acquaintance of hers not unfrequently captured bees by mistake, and when I would plead the release of some poor honey-laden wanderer, the only answer I would get was, when they once gets into the bottle, they never comes out again. Fountaine was enraged. She was also extremely disturbed by the collecting practices of some of her dear Hungarian friends, one of whom, for example, believed one had to catch everything, which meant, quote, a useless and senseless slaughter of many common butterflies, even the bad specimens being killed and thrown away. This seemed excessive to Fountaine, who tried to convince them to let the bad specimens out without killing them. Her friends argued that common butterflies and bad specimens should be killed to prevent them being caught again. Quote, a very poor excuse indeed, she noted, for the useless sacrifice of so many little lives. Her ambivalence extended to other animals. Although she was aware of the incongruity of her sensitivity to cruelty to animals and her own practice of killing for collecting, when she saw men mistreating horses in Sicily, she wrote that, quote, it seemed rather inconsistent for me to reprove them for it, with my own pocket box full of dead and dying butterflies, so I fear my reproofs had but little effect. Similarly, upon encountering boys mutilating frogs, she was horrified, but noted that she, quote, could not offer ever so gentle a reproof in consequence of my own occupation, though it was a senseless slaughter, and of course mine is not. Here again we see her oscillation between guilt and believing that her work, despite the harm she was causing, was legitimate because it was scientific. Now I'd like to talk for a bit about the persona Fountaine crafted in the articles she published in the entomological press. As I've said in the beginning, there weren't many female members of entomological societies, and similarly, women were noticeably largely absent from many entomological periodicals. For example, between 1898 and 1912, only 4 men, including, published articles in The Entomologist. And between 1871 and 1921, only 8 women published articles in the Transactions of the Entomological Society of London. So Fontaine's publications were somewhat unusual. And in a landscape mostly devoid of women, she had to develop strategies for her work to be published and respected. As a woman publishing in a male field, she used tropes that were often associated with masculinity in order to reinforce her authority. The wildness of the sights and landscapes she visited, in order to represent herself triumphing over them. And she portrayed her practice of collecting as the hunting of big game. In her diary, she confided that while writing her first article on butterflies in Sicily, she had been afraid of being too frivolous, and as a result wrote a slightly different version of her visit than what actually happened. In order to evade possible suspicions of frivolity, she interspersed observations and lists of specimens with tales of bravery. In fact, from that very first article on Fountaine From that very first article on, Fontaine's publications were chock full of the adventures that befell her during her expeditions, often showing her surmounting dangerous situations. For example, when she collected in the swamps of Costa Rica, she was, quote, risking snakes, tarantula spiders, and other horrors, which included ticks, that once during a chase covered her from head to toe. She used hunting tropes from her very first article, in which she described how, as she neared the shores of Sicily, and she made sure to emphasize that she was the first British lepidopterist to do so, she peered out through the porthole of the ship and thought, quote, of all the little sleeping insects dispersed over these mountains, as yet innocent of the hand of the spoiler. Her articles are peppered with dozens of hunting metaphors. For example, the places in which she collected are described as the, quote, happy hunting grounds of the entomologist. Butterflies are prey. They fall victim to the net, or else they are prisoners in the net, and they're caught by stalking them first. Hunting narratives emphasized not just the danger, but also the pleasures and excitements of the hunt. As such, they were an acceptable form for portraying some of the emotions that arose during a hunt, such as excitement, pleasure, disappointment, or pride. Consider the following example. I at once gave chase, trembling with excitement, and slipping and falling more than once, but the Ferusa was fast getting the best of it. Flying with the wind, it seemed to have no intention of settling or of doubling in its rapid flight. My heart sank within me, when lo, there was another, and yet another. I then found that this wanderer, though itself now quite lost to sight, had guided me to the spot where several of its companions soon fell an easy prey to my net. The tangible description of her excitement and the vivid description of the chase. Fontaine's writing is highly emotional for a scientific article. She records excitement, thrill, happiness, and sadness. The hunting narrative enabled her to display emotions on a scientific platform without seeming to be feminine. Fontaine was aware of her weaker position as a woman in the scientific world. She writes in her diary, very soon now, I should once more go out into the wide world alone, knowing that as a woman, the odds must always be against me, and yet to fight well the foes that would impose upon me, to hold my own on the slippery pathways over which my feet must tread, till I feel that so far from scorning it, I rejoice in my womanhood, for I know that its power is great and not to be overthrown. And wherein does my power lie? In the chance game of fate turning in my favor? In the solid background of a few thousands in gold which are mine? In physical attractions or mental affinities? No, in none of these things, but merely in my own identity. As such, she chose to build her authority on her collection, on the fact that she collected widely and in places most entomologists could not reach, either because they did not have the time or because they did not have the money. And she also built her authority on her first-hand knowledge of the butterfly's habits, life cycles, and interaction environment. She chose to reinforce her authority over the knowledge she had using three strategies. First was the adoption of the imperial white hunter narrative. The second was by not challenging what was expected of women in other ways. She did not argue about classifications or write about physiology, but instead stuck to collecting, illustrating, and studying the butterfly's life cycles. The third way was by de-stressing her femininity in her writing through choosing not to portray her emotions towards the butterflies and her qualms over killing them, so as not to be viewed as an emotional female. The result was a limit to the emotions she could portray. In her diary, Fontaine allowed herself to feel pity for the butterflies she killed, to personify them, and to criticize contemporary collecting practices. But in her articles, there was no place for this. My research also raises questions about what scientific knowledge is made of. We tend to think of science as objective. However, science is practiced by humans who are affected by their culture, social context, and emotions. In fact, historians of science have pointed out that even objectivity, a scientific tool that was developed in the 18th and 19th centuries, is also a kind of emotion in itself, an attempt to distance oneself from nature and to, in a way, kill the sentimental self. The art of collecting brought the collector closer on the one hand, but using instruments such as a net to catch butterflies, followed by poisonous chemicals to kill them, created a gap between the human and the animal. Fountaine most often felt sympathy towards butterflies either when meeting them in nature and seeing them fly wild, or while breeding them, and essentially living with them in her private space. She did not feel pity towards dead specimens that she saw in others' collections or in museums, and neither was she racked with guilt while looking at her own collections. Distancing from nature and from the subjectivity of animals was a kind of emotional act. In Fontaine's case, the distancing is partial. In her articles, she retains her connection to the landscape, but distances herself from the butterflies. Entomology, as it was practiced in the field, was about a whole variety of experiences, both sensory and cerebral. In a way, entomologists' perceptions were augmented. They were keenly aware of the different seasons and how they corresponded to the insects' life cycles. They were attentive to the changing weather and to the plants around them. Practitioners of science also enjoyed the aesthetics surrounding it, from the touch of a soft wing to the sensation when sliding a pin through a specimen. In addition, many entomology guidebooks also contained quotations from poets such as Shakespeare and Keats, relating to insects and nature. This was another way in which entomology augmented entomologists' experiences. It connected them to literature and poetry in a new way, and also to nature. The sources I used for this research, which are Fontaine's entire diaries from the age of 15 to 79, are unique in how personal they are. They allowed me to peek into the intimate thoughts and feelings of a female entomologist, and that enabled me to minutely explore her sometimes uneasy relationship with the creatures that formed the foundation of her identity as an entomologist. Through her diaries, I was also able to study her relationship to knowledge. Knowledge is made out of both science and our emotional reactions to the natural world, and stems from how we relate to the world. The practice of collecting in nature enmeshed objective knowledge together with other kinds of knowledge, such as emotional reactions and feeling a part of nature. Thank you very much.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Joanne. That was really fascinating. If I may, whilst the audience is thinking about questions, could I take the opportunity to pose on to you first, which is what's inspired you to work on such a fascinating character, and how did you come across her work? I mean, it seems such an incredible story, and the diaries are maybe were just have this picture of these diaries laying in a library somewhere undiscovered. So how did you come across them, and kind of what's your story in terms of interacting with the life of Margaret Fountaine?
Thank you for your question. So actually, before I turned to history, I started out from studying biology, which was my dream since I was a child. But when I started studying history instead, I wasn't planning on doing a history of science. I was actually interested in women travelers, and I was looking for a woman or some kind of text that hasn't really been explored by historians yet. And I came across Fountaine in a footnote in a book written by my supervisor for my master's. So Fountaine, she's not completely undiscovered. What happens is she left her diaries to the Norwich Museum. They did not know they were diaries. They were in a box with a note that said they were only to be opened, the box was only to be opened in 1978 or 1979. Nobody knew what was in there. When they opened diaries, they invited a journalist to come join the unveiling. And they discovered the diaries, and he decided to publish them. So he published a very abridged version, which is out of print, but you can find it in libraries. So this is what I started working from when I was still working on my master's. And then I went to Norwich and actually photocopied the entire 3,203 pages of the diaries. There's a lot. So yeah, I started out being mostly interested in her travels and how she related to nature, but very soon I got into the history of entomology and the entomological community with the insects, and I just became fascinated by that. So my PhD right now is not just about her, it's about the entomological community, the British entomological community more broadly during the 19th and early 20th centuries.
How far are you through your PhD? Have you nearly finished? I mean, it seems like a lot of work that you've presented to us today. Is you nearly completed that?
This is one chapter, and I still have 1 year to go. I have 3 chapters down, and either 1 or 2 more to go.
Cool. And were you expecting, I guess, when you sort of entered into this, that to really be focusing a lot on the process of science? I guess you mentioned kind of science as a social construct, and this idea of kind of rationality in science. I'm really very interested in that, actually, and I just wondered if you could sort of tell us a little bit about your thinking on maybe how that affects public perception of science. We think, we see the PM standing up in the daily briefings, following the science and acting as though it is this sort of, just the data, and how important do you think is the storytelling and the emotion and the true feeling of discovery in the public perception of science?
I think it's very important. I mean, data is data. What to do with it? And you can do so many things with data and with statistics. You show them all sorts of different ways. But it's not just that. It's even more basic things, how we think about how the world works. These things change over time. This is one of the things you learn when studying the history of science and looking at how science changed over the past couple of hundreds of years, even thousands of years. So can you remind me of the beginning of the question?
Well, it was just more your thoughts, really, in terms of it feels, you're right, it has changed over hundreds of years, but it feels like we're in a time right now where science is being portrayed much more kind of rationally, objectively, and just about the kind of the sort of Richard Dawkins approach of it is just the scientific method, the hypothesis, and so forth. Whereas what you have described is very much the scientific process being embedded into a social construct, being done by people with emotions, with sense of joy, excitement, disappointment, and so forth. So I just wondered what you felt about this 2 different views of the process of science on the public perception of science, and whether today, for instance, maybe we should be talking much more about the emotion and about the kind of scientific method as being one that involves people with real emotions.
I think we should. I think that emotions and, as I said, the way we interact with the world and with science, I think it's an integral part. It should be an integral part of the scientific process and of knowledge making. I think there has been too much of a chasm between the sciences and the humanities. And I do think it is important to try and find ways to bridge those.
Great. Great, thank you. So it's done as I expected. This little conversation we've had between the two of us has now led to lots of other little questions flowing in. So that's great. So I'm going to ask them in order. So we have, first of all, a question from Ellen Ketchington, which says, thank you for a very interesting talk. Do you know what her relationship was with the other 5 female members of the society?
Yes, so she only had a real relationship with one of them, Mary Delebeshnikov. So she was another lepidopterist who also traveled a lot around the world, and I work on her as well in my research. So they traveled to Algiers together. They went collecting together in Algiers, and they also visited each other once or twice in the United Kingdom. But beyond that, she didn't have any special relationships with other female entomologists.
Interesting. Thank you for that. So we have now a question from Warwick Bell, who is asking, did Fountaine have a particular focus in her work? That is, was her interest in studying the butterflies themselves or in the processes related to collecting them?
I would say it was both. She did not really have a special focus. She was very interested in tropical butterflies, however. So a lot of the important work she did, when I was mentioning places that most entomologists couldn't really reach. So that was all sorts of tropical forests in Africa and in South America and places like Fiji and so on. So no, she didn't really have a special focus beyond that. And for her, it was both about the joy of collecting and also about the scientific aspect. She does mention in her diaries that she viewed herself as an entomologist and she viewed what she was doing as science.
Excellent. And then we have a final question, but please, audience, please submit some more if you have burning questions. Can you connect Fontaine's focus on the life cycle of butterflies to the earlier work by Maria Sibylla Merian? Both reared caterpillars as part of their process. Is there something about female experience that opened up this whole life focus? That's from Catherine Lavender.
Okay, so Maria Sibylla Merian she's a very interesting person as well. I don't know if Fountaine knew her. She does not mention her in the diaries. I do think, however, there is a point that could be made about women perhaps seeing the more holistic aspects of butterflies. So rather than just looking at dead specimens, Fountaine studied the life cycles. She found the food plants of many butterflies. So she was the one to discover food plants for many butterflies that were not known before then. Because she captured all of them herself, she also knew what were their predators. And she was more aware of their entire environment. And I think, again, it's hard to make a real hard point about this, but you could say it is possibly a female view in a way.
Was it unique? So just before I ask the last one, was it unique at that time for people to be thinking almost around the ethics of animal collecting, or the ethics around the protection of cruelty to animals? Like today we have a sector which is kind of quite highly regulated in terms of thinking about animals and so forth. Do you think that was a normal thing to do? Was it widely spoke about at that time, or was it just something that she individually reflected on herself?
So during the entire 19th century, the whole idea of being anti-cruelty to animals starts developing. So as early as in 1824, the RSPCA is founded. In the 1870s, you have the anti-vivisection debates. So there was a public outcry, a lot of it by women, by the way, against using animals for experiments or dissecting animals for either scientific or medical purposes. And people had opposing views on this. So even Darwin participated in these debates, and he was actually, some of the time he was anti-vivisection, in fact. So these are not unique views. However, they are somewhat unique among practicing entomologists. Again, you do have other precedents. So you have, I found at least 2 entomologists who, in the early 19th century, who turned to things like botany because they just couldn't stomach killing for the sake of practicing science. So this is throughout the 19th century, throughout the 20th century, until it reaches where we are today, which is there is much more awareness for the ethics of cruelty and of killing animals.
Very interesting, thank you. So we have now a question from Ellen Ketchington, who's asking, do you know the reason for the embargo on her diaries? Did the same apply to her specimen collection? Has that been used by others for research purposes? Is it properly providence, for example? Thanks again.
Thanks, Alan. Okay, so first of all, I think the reason she did not want the diaries to be read until the 70s is because she wanted to wait until everybody mentioned in them was dead. So what was actually written in the letter was that it was only to be opened, I think, 100 years after the first diary was written, or I don't remember, but there was like 100 years from the time she was born or something like that. So I think it's mostly about privacy in a way. Her collection is properly housed in the Norwich Museum. It is used by researchers to this day. So in fact, the butterfly specimens are housed in Norwich. Her sketchbooks, there are 4 sketchbooks showing the life cycles of the butterflies that she reared. Those are in the Natural History Museum. And the reason she did not leave the butterflies to the Natural History Museum as well is because the practice of the Natural History Museum when getting collections is to disperse them among the existing collections. And it was very important for her that her collection stay as it is. But it is used. Simply, researchers have to go between London and Norwich to sort of, because in one place you can see the caterpillar in all its different stages, and then you have the actual butterfly in Norwich.
Did she say not very nice things about other people in her diaries? Was she sort of a little, do you think she was that, you know, she's like a little embarrassed about the way she portrayed people sometimes, or have you not kind of come across that? Is it, maybe it's just, I'm just kind of wondering why the sort of like, kind of, well, I'm not paranoia, I guess, but you know, being very careful about people not being around when they're revealed.
No, I don't think. No, I don't think that's the reason. She doesn't really say like any nasty things about anyone.
She doesn't come across as a nasty person from what you've told us about.
I mean, you know, she was quite racist, so this is something I also explore in my research, but she herself would not have seen that as a problem. So that wouldn't be the reason. So I don't know why she chose to do that.
Interesting. So Catherine Lavender would like to ask another question. Yes, you may. I have written a monograph comparing early women anthropologists' field notebooks and their published work. Oh, how interesting. This question of having to adopt a professionally dispassionate stance in their published work seems a common pattern among early women scientists and even today. Do you find a larger pattern of this in your research beyond Fountaine? That's a really interesting question.
First of all, your research sounds really fascinating. I would love to hear more about it. Secondly, I'm not sure. So, because so far I've only been focusing on the entomological community during that specific time, and there haven't been a lot of women that published during that time. And each one of them, which is actually the first chapter of my PhD, sort of chooses a different strategy. So one of them, actually, all of her articles are as dry as they come. It's all about classification. There's no narrative at all. But her situation was quite different. So she was the daughter of a famous ornithologist called Sharp, who worked at the British Museum, and she managed to get a position at the British Museum through him at a time when women simply did not work there. So it was a completely different situation than Fontaine's. The other woman I mentioned earlier, Mary de la Bechnicol, so she did something similar to Fontaine, though her diaries are actually quite dry as well. But in her publications, she actually she's even more extreme than Fontaine. It seems like she measures everything. So when she describes the landscape, she describes what rocks things are made of, how far away is that mountain, how high it is. It's like it is an attempt to sort of impose an imperial view over the landscape and sort of impose her authority over it. And there was another woman, Eleanor Ormerod, who is again very different in her own way, and she founded the entire field of economic entomology in Britain. She started in the 1860s and did so until she died in about 1901. So she became a sort of almost the priestess of economic entomology, and she positioned herself as a kind of helper to agriculturists and to farmers. So she found other ways to maintain her femininity while also having authority. So yeah, I think I would need to look into other fields of natural history as well in order to see a larger pattern here.
Excellent, thank you. So I noticed in the chat that Padma also wants to ask a question. So I'm going to hand over to Padma to do the kind of wrap up and to ask her question. I wouldn't want hers to go unanswered, but just from a personal point of view, Joanne, I just really want to say thank you so much for sharing your work with us. I mean, I've enjoyed this so much and learned so much, and I'm sure that the rest of the attendees today would join me if they could in giving you a round of applause. So from my point of view, thank you so much. And I just want to hand over to Padma. Padma, are you still there? So you can ask your question.
Still here, yeah.
Excellent.
Thanks so much, Joanne. My question is related to modern collection. Do people still collect, and do you think going forward these collections will be available to researchers in the future? And I mean, I feel that journal writing is pretty much out of fashion. I don't know if it's coming back into fashion, but is that a loss? I read a paper recently that said that scientific research will definitely face a void going forward because of the lack of collection.
Thank you, Padma. That's an interesting question. So I have to confess that I don't know much about the practice of collecting nowadays. I would imagine it would be much harder to do, especially for amateurs, as a lot of species would simply be forbidden to collect them. I think that collections nowadays are mostly made by institutes, such as museums and universities. About you said about like were you talking about like the art of collecting dying out? Because so what I know is that, for example, the whole field of classification, which was what a lot of entomologists did in the 19th century and for a lot of the 20th century. So this is disappearing as well. So I know that in a lot of universities, it's not even taught. So today that knowledge is mostly held by amateurs. So this is something I didn't really go into, but I'm also very interested in amateur professional relationships. And natural history, and especially in entomology, which is what I know the most about, amateurs continued, like they played a very important part during the searching, and they continue to play a very important part until today. For example, the classification example, they just hold kinds of knowledge that professional entomologists in universities don't have anymore.
I think you've given me a couple of more ideas for lectures, but thank you so much, Joanne, for giving us the afternoon, and thanks to Gail, and I hope everybody enjoyed it. This will be up on YouTube, and join us again tomorrow for another Insect Week event. Thank you, and bye.
Goodbye, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.